I think we're ready to go.
Ready to go?
I, I don't know, Matthew, I haven't really sorted out a plan for this, but if you maybe just want to sort of introduce yourself and the work that you do, uh,
Sure.
and then there might be some sort of time for some questions and discussion as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I had a look at those points that you sent over. So, yeah, I'm Michael Duffy. Sam Duffy is my son who went through last year, did VCE, and Aaron taught him, and Mickey Duffy, who's now doing Indonesian as well. So both myself and Francesca, I realised later it might even be worthwhile asking Francesca later if she wants to talk because she covers lived a different life in a way. We both lived there for 2.5 years in Jakarta because I got a job when an in Indonesia doing scientific research on malaria. So Francesca joined me and she worked as an editor on the Jakarta Post, the English language newspaper there. So she had quite interesting experiences there, quite different to mine. I worked in an Indonesian institute in sort of the central public hospital in Jakarta, which is called the Rumah Sakit Cipto. What is it now? Rumah Sakit Cipto Mangunkusumo, which is in Jalan Diponegoro in Cikini, which is the centre of Jakarta. So we lived there for 2.5 years. We started off living out in the southeastern suburbs and commuting. It's about 10 kilometres away. On a Friday night during Musim Hujan, which is the wet season, it can take 3 hours to travel 10 kilometres. I'm a cyclist, so I brought a bike there to cycle, but even I wasn't prepared to deal with the Jakarta cycling situation. It was plus in the wet season, it's a torrent. So we ended up moving closer to town, even though a long way out of town was only 10 kilometres. Population density in Jakarta back then, and we went there in 1998. There was 15 million people in Jakarta, and Greater Jakarta, which is I guess like metropolitan Melbourne. But the area is a fair bit smaller than Melbourne, so they're jammed in, and it's very, very busy. Lots of traffic jams. Macet, they call it. So we moved then into the old part of town, into Cikini, on the border of Menteng, and that was great living in there, right in the heart of Jakarta, and it was a short walk to work. So I worked in this Indonesian institute that had been set up inside the old hospital. It's called the Eichmann Institute for Molecular Biology, still going. It was set up by the Vice President Habibie, who was at the time was the Minister for Technology and Science, and he was really interested in medicine and biomedicine, and he was a great friend. Actually, I think he was in-laws with the head of the Walter Eliza Hall Institute's director. I think his son or something was married to Gus Russell's daughter, or something like that. Anyway, so through these connections, which is a classic Indonesian way of doing things, family connections, they had established a large aid project through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and we went over there to conduct malaria research and to train Indonesian scientists in malaria research. And actually, they were training us as well, conducting field research in Indonesia. Went there in 1998 and left halfway through 2000. So we were there. We had to come out briefly because we were there during the fall of Suharto and through the rise of democracy. That was a tremendous experience to be in a country that becomes, through popular revolution, becomes a democracy. Well, popular revolution is probably a strong term to describe it, but there was certainly a lot of popular sentiment and public uprising, and young people like yourselves from the Catholic high schools and universities getting out there and protesting the government, which sort of precipitated or when a couple of students at a Catholic university were shot by the police and killed, and part of these rolling protests that were really driven by protests about petrol prices and food prices, but then just became a society-wide movement to remove a repressive government. So we were there during that, and that was tremendous. The first election, everyone came to work proudly with their little finger purple because they'd all have to dip their finger in the ink to prove that they'd only voted once. And they were like walking in the door, all Indonesians ecstatic, holding their fingers up. They had, I think, like 90% attendance or over 90% attendance to the polls. So it was a real testament to their commitment to democracy, and they still have this, quite a powerful belief in it, despite the I guess the challenges of trying to run democracy in a country that large and that disparate, culturally disparate, and with all the incipient problems that corruption brings to trying to do that sort of work, to try to run that kind of a country. So I work mainly in the lab. I'm a molecular parasitologist, so I work on malaria parasites. We grow them, which is what I was just doing before, which is why I was late. It's growing these parasites in a petri dish with blood and culture medium. The malaria parasites, they live inside a red blood cell. They've got a 48-hour life cycle inside the red blood cells. So they replicate about 5-10-fold. They have a very narrow range, though, of what we call parasitemia, or the percentage of red cells that can be infected. So we need to keep them around 5%, and so I have to keep going in there and making blood smears and counting them and subbing the cultures down, which is what I was doing. We do a lot of molecular parasitology. We do a lot of like genetic engineering. So you may have heard of things like CRISPR-Cas9, which has been in the news a bit lately, a way of gene editing. We certainly would have seen aspects of it where they're talking about, Chinese scientist who made a genetically engineered human was using this CRISPR-Cas9 technology. So we use that to genetically engineer parasites experimentally to try and generate vaccines and drugs and investigate potential drug targets. When we were in Indonesia, I was working more on aspects of pathogenesis of severe malaria and malaria in pregnancy. So we were interested in how the parasite causes disease in pregnant women, because it specifically targets pregnant women, and broadly in the population. And I did that work with Indonesians in collaboration. There were Indonesian students doing PhDs in Australia at the time, and we had Indonesian research assistants and Australian research assistants working with me, and I was paired with Indonesian postdoctoral scientists, and we still collaborate and work today. We recently worked on a project in West Papua, so near the Freeport mine. There's a large health centre there. I wasn't actually allowed to go to West Papua because it was very politically sensitive, and you're probably aware of the West Papuan movement for independence, which Australia doesn't really support, unlike the independence of East Timor, which Australia eventually did. But it's a very sensitive issue for the Indonesian government, so they won't let foreigners in there for purposes like medical research. But we did collect samples there from people with malaria and did conduct a trial or investigations into the causes of severe malaria, and made some what we think are important discoveries that could help towards designing a vaccine. And the other work I do is drug-related work, which has not been so much in Indonesia. Okay, so that's kind of me. And I guess a canned history of what we did there. We travelled a lot while we were there as well. I mean, I've got to say it's a tremendous place to live if you're young, Jakarta. I think it would be a hard place to bring up kids because it's not easy to get into the outdoors in town. You walk out here and you've got parks and gardens and stuff everywhere, but I don't know if any of you have been to Jakarta, but it's a big Asian city and it's big and it's quite busy. And by Western standards, it's dirty. Although I knew people who visited Jakarta for a holiday from Delhi to come out and relax. So it's all horses for courses, I guess. But the thing about Jakarta is it's such a diverse place. I think if you visit it briefly, it can be overwhelming and just seem like an enormous, dirty hodgepodge of a place. But it's basically a city that's evolved from, and they still call them kampungs, so a series of villages that have coalesced into a city somehow. And when you drive around the city, you'll see, even on the main roads, the side lanes will have these gateways over them, often with quite chilling slogans about getting rid of communism still in the 1950s over the gateways. And those little gateways, the streets that run off the main roads, are leading into kampungs, which are the remnant, I guess, of these old village structures, but they still govern at the same kind of principle where you'll have effectively like it's a smaller area than a suburb. It's a sort of a semi-suburb, but it will have like a village head effectively. And this is how they organise their society in a way. It's very, as many Asian societies are, they're not as individualistic as Western societies. And there's a much more of a kind of a community coherence in a way. And social family bonds are very, very important, partly because they don't have social security that we do, which is the other reason the main reason probably that drives so much problems with corruption is because they're so indebted to family that even prime ministers and presidents will turn a blind eye when someone absconds with entire superannuation savings for the public service and things like that. But that means that they can Indonesians can run a society that might seem fairly chaotic to the outside, but it's very vertically integrated because the minister working right down to the kampung, there's a series of village heads, and everyone reports to the village head, and everyone complies largely with what the village head wants to do. So there's a sense of social cohesion there. They're all working towards that point. That kind of feeds into some of the questions you guys were asking about how their health system compares or how they deal with health problems. I think they have a real advantage there in some ways, because even though that they may not have the education and wealth that you guys have, they have this what we would probably find quite confining social compliance and structure, which means that if the government decides that there's a health issue that should be addressed in a certain way, that can be fed down through this system. And if they get the village head on side, then the people who are part of his community will largely comply with what he wants them to do. So that's the negotiations that we invariably indulge in when we engage in when we want to go out and do field research. You've got to go and find the village head and talk to him first and make sure that he supports your approach, and then he'll say, come and sign up to volunteer to participate in this trial, and everyone will go, okay, that sounds like a good idea, and they'll go and do that. So Jakarta is as I was saying, it's a very large and diverse series of these kampungs, and so many different cultures. So there are 20,000 islands, I think, in Indonesia, and there's so many different racial, tribal groups there, all in this one city, all largely getting along. They have lots and lots and lots and lots of different kind of cultural and racial jibes and jokes they make about each other all the time. And after 2.5 years, they're only scratching the surface at all the differences that they could perceive amongst each other, which also relates to like welcoming foreigners and things like that. They're very, very welcoming, just because they've got so much diversity themselves. So they're quite accommodating to diversity. The other questions you were asking about, like speaking and how did Indonesian help? So for me, because I was in the Indonesian Research Institute, English is really the language of science, and so even the undergraduate students and the research assistants actually had pretty good English. And it was much easier for us to converse in English than for them to put up with my very broken and poor Indonesian. So we would usually talk in English. With the admin staff, I often use Indonesian because their English, they didn't need to converse in English ever, and so that their English wasn't, their English wasn't great. Outside of work, we used Indonesian much more because where we lived in Cikini, the border of Menteng, it's not an expat area. There's large areas of Jakarta which are expatriate areas, where in the south of Jakarta, that's what we name it. I'm having the suburb now, but there's a couple of suburbs there which are large expatriate enclaves, and you can you can live your entire life there and never speak a word of Indonesian probably. But where we were was an Indonesian suburb with very few Westerners there, and so you had to be able to speak to like shop catch a cab.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
At the University of Melbourne, do they like offer a course to learn Indonesian, like to continue learning it? Or is it like, do you only continue Indonesian if you like what the job that you have, like if you kind of focus on a job that you can get opportunities overseas? How does that work?
So I don't know whether, no, I should know the answer to that, whether Melbourne Uni offers Indonesian. I've not had a student who studies Indonesian. We don't often have students who study other languages, but we do occasionally. If they do offer Indonesian, there's no reason you couldn't combine it with a science degree, for sure. We certainly get occasionally students coming through learning Japanese or Mandarin, and they'll follow that through as an undergraduate degree.
There definitely is an Indonesian program at Melbourne Uni. I know the lecturers there. Just to clear that up, but it is part of the humanities department, I guess. So it's not. It's easy. I think a lot easier if you're studying humanities and arts to find the Indonesian stream. Whereas I think science, which is probably why I wanted you to think about it sort of early on, it might take a bit of. But I think the Melbourne model actually helps to find credits to study languages.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. I'm also sorry, I had another question. So I want to do an undergraduate of biomedicine in the University of Melbourne once I finish school. I was wondering how long does like that course last for?
So undergraduate biomedicine, I think, is 3 years. I think they're all standard 3 years now. Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of people do biomedical. We get a lot of the. So I'm in the Faculty of Medicine, so we get a lot of biomedicine students come through and they do honours years with us. So that would be a 4th year. Many of the kids are doing biomedicine because they want to do postgraduate medical degree, and then that would be additional years on top of it. So you do a 3-year biomedicine, bachelor of biomedicine, and then they sign up for. There's some exam they have to do to apply to be the medical course. And I'm not even sure how many years that is, but it's been another 3 or 4 years on top of it, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Often I'll do the honours first and then apply for the medical thing. And so you get out another year. So you have 4 years of undergraduate biomedicine, basically, plus medical degree.
Thank you.
No one else? Any other questions? I'd just say about the course that we occasionally do get them coming through with science. I think it's often students who maybe have got they're native speakers or they've got a strong cultural affiliation, through family and stuff, and so they've probably got good language skills and they pick it up as maybe an easy credit. The one issue with a science degree that you need to, I guess, think about is what you'd probably want to think early about what you wanted to do with it, because the way they arrange the courses now, usually second and certainly third year subjects will have prerequisites. Subjects you've got to do in the first year. So I'd say I think it's a great idea to do a language. I think it really opens your opportunities later. And if you're going to pick a language, like Indonesia is a close neighbour, that's this huge middle class is growing, and it's really going to become more and more important for Australia. Particularly, you think about the issues that are occurring now with frictions with China and stuff like that. And I think there's a cultural affinity that I certainly felt with Indonesians. They're quite fond of us, really, despite all that broadly. And there's historical reasons for that. But we also think not dissimilar, like Asian societies. Often the people say it's kind of culturally different, but actually Indonesians and Australians have quite a similar sense of humour. One thing you'll find. They have quite a dry sense of humour. They also have this thing that they regard themselves as, I don't know, kind of the rebels of Asia in a way, which Australians also have this kind of outlaw kind of thing that they believe themselves to be outlaws. And so Indonesians have lots and lots of jokes about Singapore, how uptight Singaporeans are. and that they take pride in the fact that they throw rubbish on the street and this sort of thing. Singaporeans would never be so bold. So there's actually a lot of similarities there, cultural similarities. But I digressed a bit from what I was going to say about the course. So I think it's a great idea to do it, and Indonesian is a great one to do. But you really need to think carefully that you don't close doors, whatever subject you take early on, because you need to maintain the possibilities to deal with all the prerequisites in the second and third year. And I know it's something that's evolved more recently, particularly with the Melbourne model, and it's not transparent early on which prerequisites you'll need for where you want to end up, and there's such a diversity of courses available now. That's something I think I would really recommend you think about early on when you've applied for a course. You think, okay, that's done, I don't have to worry about it now, and then you enroll and you've got to pick your subjects and you give it a week. I'd start thinking about it a little bit earlier than that, and I'd look into where the second and third years where you want to be. And if you can engage, I know it's very hard to think about careers, but if you can think about careers, what sort of subjects you need to do be doing careers. Grace, you got a question?
Yeah, this is just generally about research science. Is it like a bad time to want to go into it because of, funding being a bit low? I can just imagine it being frustrating. So I'm not really sure whether I would want to go down that path or not.
I'd have to say it's really hard to say at this point. I think it's possibly a great opportunity because we're at one of those great disruptions in history, right? Coronavirus has come through, and it's really given a lot of complacent governments a pretty serious kick up pants about how they've been running their societies and what they've prioritised. So, at one stage I was going to leave science because it's so difficult. So I'll go and become a patent attorney. And I told her, essentially, I guess the guy's a mentor of mine, a very senior scientist in Australia. And he said to me, that's a real shame. He said, we've got plenty of lawyers. We don't need any more lawyers, but we do need more scientists. So I think that's true. It's maybe not often rewarded, and it looks challenging from the outside to get the cash. But I also think because of this disruption we're seeing, that may change a little bit. I think the agendas of our societies might change a bit. I think certainly there will be a tail on this with funding. They'll try and cut back funding because governments don't like spending on public funding, and this government's already flagged that it wants to reduce its revenues through tax breaks and whatnot, so it'll have less money to spend. But they had a very big scare, and so issues like public health funding or infectious disease, I think they will probably maintain investment for a bit. In Australia, we have several streams of funding. So the MRFF is this large biomedical fund set up by Joe Hockey, actually, Medical Research Futures Fund. It's a little bit hard to access for basic scientists like me, because I work with genetic engineering with parasites, and it's hard to get money for that. But if you're working on diseases of Australia, that's actually quite a substantial amount of money that's available. So, if you're working in dementia or breast cancer or something, you can get money fairly easily from that. But having said easily, it's all relative. I mean, it's difficult to establish a academic career in the university doing research. I'm not going to try and pretend that it's not. But there are other options. There's industry, and it's a career where you can travel. It's also a career where you never have to wonder whether there's any point to it, because you don't have to look at the statistics. There's 200 or 400,000 deaths per year of malaria, so you know why you're doing your job. Does that answer your question? Help a bit? But I think there's, I wouldn't gild the lily, but I would certainly say it's worth. It's an enjoyable job, and I don't think it's totally dire at the moment. I would always say what I advise my kids to do. It's a good idea to do something that you think someone might want to pay you to do. I probably shouldn't say that, but that's what I tell them.
I don't know if anybody else has any questions. I've got one though, but in terms of using your Indonesian with Indonesians when you're living there and traveling there, even using your street Indonesian, how did you find how receptive they were, or how much it opened up the relationship or the communication when you're able to speak Indonesian with Indonesians?
They love it when you speak to them in their own language. I've often reflected on this as something like it's quite different here. I think if someone in Australia is asking directions, they can't speak any English, then we kind of smile politely and give up. If they got broken English, then we'll like help them out and tell them where to go. But we're not likely to invite them home for a cup of tea and then want to talk to them about their grandkids and stuff. Whereas speaking a bit of Indonesian can be an entree to a much more extensive conversation. I want to talk to you about your family, marriage, and marital status, and all the rest of it. How many children? Why don't you have more children? Etc. Etc. So I think it really helps. I don't know whether it'd be different with proper Indonesian or my very bad Indonesian. If Indonesians want to talk that I couldn't understand, it would be very easy for them to do it. It's a language that has a lot of similes as well. I think it's picked it up from having so many language groups feeding into it, right? Despite supposedly being a simple language, they have not as many similes and homonyms as English, but I reckon there's quite a few. So they'll just pick a more complicated word. And if they want to lose me, they can just use grammar. So I can never keep track of the prefixes and the suffixes. I admire you all for being able to find out what a word actually means in Indonesian, because it must be the only language. People say it's a very easy language, but it must be the only language where you take the first letter off the root word, throw it away, and put two prefixes and three suffixes on the end of it, and then you've got to figure out what it means. I think that's quite challenging. So they could lose me like that, and I would often use very, very rough grammar, the prefix here or there thrown in front of the root word. But Indonesians often speak like that in the street as well. I mean, it'd be a bit more grammar than I would, but they're certainly not speaking like you see it written in a newspaper. So I would struggle to read newspapers, but I could hold extensive conversations with Indonesians. But they would be accommodating for my level of grammar.
Can I ask another question? So I want to do neuroscience once like I finish school, so that's where I want to focus. I was wondering, so once like you do your undergraduate, so like in biomedicine, and then you do like the major of like neuroscience, is that when you kind of start to go to like other hospitals and kind of shadow a doctor, like watch them kind of do their job? Do you like kind of work in a hospital while you're studying at the same time?
I think that would be when you've started the postgraduate medical degree. So I might be wrong because I've not studied neuroscience, a bit of neurology at university many years ago, but I haven't really interacted much with the undergraduate neuroscience. But I suspect that they wouldn't have undergraduate biomedicine students interacting much with patients.
Okay.
But
Is that more when you're like majoring, like kind of the final years of like studying?
well, they may. They're typically, I suspect you would be doing you might do research projects. So you might be using clinical samples, and you might have some limited interaction with patients. But typically, interactions with patients is stuff you do within a medical degree. So the biomedicine is a stream bachelor of biomedicine is a stream into the medical degree. But then to enter the medical degree, you have to do an exam and then do a subsequent degree. It's a separate degree.
Yeah.
But I might be wrong about going to the hospitals. They might have some short interaction with hospitals, but I don't think it'd be extensive.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries.
Any other questions? I do have another one. I was reading up actually about there's some research either in last year or this year where I think it was researchers from Monash were working with researchers from Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta on the Wolbachia bacteria. So for the students, it's essentially a bacteria which helps to stop the mosquito vector, and they're testing it for dengue fever in Yogyakarta. So, this is obviously not your background, but with your background in malaria, what's the future of scientific cooperation and collaboration between Australia and Indonesia, and particularly maybe with COVID developing, is there opportunities there as well for Australians and Indonesians to be working together?
Yeah, definitely, I think so, and there's a desire to do so at both the Indonesian institutional and university level, and at the Australian academic level. For the Indonesians, they have some barriers that are institutional is the wrong word, like systemic barriers from the government and regulatory perspective. So there's concerns about them being basically used as and reasonable concerns about them being basically used as a large sample bank by the West. So people come and take blood samples from Indonesians and then go away and do the research, and Indonesians just withdraw blood and that's it. And so they're not keen on that model. That was really exacerbated during one of the earlier near or epidemics, I guess we had like bird flu or swine flu or something. I can't remember which one's which. And some Americans took some samples from Indonesia, and then they sequenced the virus strain and they patented it with the plan of making a vaccine out of it. And the Indonesian government was furious about this. It was like, you can't use samples from Indonesian people that we've helped you get to then go and make a vaccine that you're going to patent and try and sell back to us. So they basically introduced very stringent regulations about samples. So if we bring samples from Indonesia, they have to be brought here by an Indonesian scientist. And then the Indonesian scientist has to stay here while they're being analysed, and then they have to supervise the destruction before they go home. And that's just not, it's so onerous. It's not financially feasible with grants and stuff to be able to pay for that sort of research. So that's been a bit of a barrier, to be honest. On top of that, they have turf wars in Indonesia. So they've got, what's it called? Kesehatan. The Department of Health, I forgot what it's called now. They have a research arm, and that research arm is a bit of a hindrance to the institutes and the universities in Indonesia, because they see it as like a poor reflection on them in a way if the Indonesian institutes and universities do well. They actually, instead of facilitating research, they try and slow it down on them. So that can be a bit of a problem. But at the level of the institutions and universities, and probably at the level of like parliamentary governments, this is the bureaucracies that are interfering. The parliamentary government, I think there's definite interest and desire to do things. It's just been a little bit difficult to execute. So where we've done quite well is training, I think, and that's probably where we develop the relationships. There's lots of Indonesian students coming in, lots of Indonesian scientists and clinicians who do training and then go back. And once you've got those personal relationships, it makes it much easier to navigate the barriers erected by various government departments or their own different regulatory agendas. And then, of course, there's also the political aspect to it. So it's fine if we're working in Jakarta or something, but they don't want us to go to Papua, for example, which is where most of the malaria in Indonesia is. That makes it a bit difficult for us. Large trials like that, that's a great example. The Indonesians have a massive problem with dengue. They're really quite open to these sorts of controls. Indonesia is a massive country with a massive middle class. It's got this public education system which actually is pretty good. So people are, quite knowledgeable, really well educated, considering the average wage and whatnot. They're quite well educated in Indonesia. Usually have got through, and even in the villages, they'll completed some level of primary school, low secondary school. So they can understand and what the point of a trial which might involve, for example, with Wolbachia, releasing absolute bucket loads of mosquitoes, right? And so you've got to convince these people living in the village, we're going to inundate you with mosquitoes, but it's for your own good. And get them to say, oh, yeah, okay. And yeah, they're quite willing to do that because they can understand and conceive, well, this is an important thing for us. And that's not an inconsiderable hurdle to overcome. You know, if you think about issues like Ebola as a good example, the trouble they had in parts of West Africa where many years of civil conflict had destroyed the education training systems, and people living there really struggled to accept the government message about what you need to do to protect yourself from something as deadly as Ebola. And so their burial practices, they just couldn't get the people to adapt or alter their burial practices, and they were wanting to keep the bodies of dead relatives in the house and bathe them, bury them personally, and as a consequence, everyone was getting infected and dying. 80% mortality from Ebola. So that is a problem that you wouldn't have to deal with.
I thought it was interesting, actually. You were talking about the communal or social sort of nature of Indonesia. With the COVID situation at the moment, I guess there's a minority, but still a vocal minority here in Australia who are very anti complying with directives such as wearing a face mask. Whereas I don't see that very much happening in Indonesia, maybe because they have that communal sense that they're responsibility for their communities and other people around.
Yeah, I think that would probably be true. I think that they've got probably a bigger barrier in that the government has not been proactive as ours, and like anywhere, the governments, you can see the same here, ministers will try and shift blame and pretend it's not their responsibility, but it's really ramped up over there and amplified. So they'd be a bit, they can be a bit Trumpian. They're like, we'll try and stop people wearing face masks because that would reflect on them badly. If people realise that if they had worn face masks, they would have died. That's a crazy thing. Yeah, but I think that issue about if you can communicate a message, and you have a justifiable reason for it, and you have the support of the social structure in the village, then they're very receptive and very willing to help out and participate, probably more so than us.
Were there any other questions? If there's no more questions, maybe we'll just sort of wrap things up and finish off. Thank you very much. But maybe just a final question for me anyway. Where would you say was your favorite place to travel to in Indonesia, and why?
Oh wow! I mean, we travelled around a lot. We loved it. I saw you said that you've been to Bunaken diving. So we went to Manado quite a bit because I had had a malaria field site there. We were collecting samples. Must have been about 3 or 4 times. So yeah, 4 times. So I love Bunaken and Manado and that part of Sulawesi. But all over, magnificent. We used to drive out of Jakarta often down to the south coast to Pulauan Ratu, which is sort of directly opposite, and it's lovely down there. Often fly to Bali, go diving. I mean, Bali is, people go a little bit up to Bali. It's so touristy, but it's lovely as well, and it's easy to get away. Find nice parts of Bali, what it was back then. Aceh, went to Aceh a couple of times. It's really, really nice and quite different. People are very different there. And also Sulawesi, the south. We went down a bit, Wakatobi. I can't remember the name of the nearest town, but sort of the southeastern corner of Sulawesi and the islands off there. There's this magnificent island down there. Everyone Indonesians are tremendously friendly, and around Jakarta we did a lot of travel. So like Pangandaran and Yogyakarta and Bandung, all those sorts of places. So if I was to pick a favourite out of all that, I don't know, maybe Manado, and Bunaken. Yeah, it's also beautiful though. It's magnificent. Central Sulawesi went there for a bit as well. It's really lovely. I guess the diving's good in Manado.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good to hear that because well, I'm not sure about the students, but you very rarely hear about Sulawesi and the outer islands. You only ever hear about, say, Jakarta, maybe hear a little bit about Borneo or Sumatra. But yeah, there's a lot of really great places that sort of are off the beaten track a little bit.
Yeah, magnificent. I mean, we were there at Aceh before it got tidal wave, so like it's changed a lot. It's been all rebuilt. I'd love to go back to the places we couldn't get to because of the civil disputes, so around Ambon and Ternate. And we caught ferries a lot. They used to have these boats, Pelney boats. I mean, they still have, but they've changed them. They didn't used to have a what do you call it, like a limit. So they just keep selling tickets for the boat. And we bought first class tickets, which was much cheaper than an airfare, but it meant that we had a cabin. But in the corridor outside the cabin, there was people camped, and everywhere there was just people camped. Yeah, those boats would stop off the coast of Ternate and Ambon, so we could see the clover trees in the distance, sort of thing. And then the army would be disembarking onto little, I don't know, lighter sort of boats, and they'd go out to the island. But we didn't actually go and dock on those islands. We didn't want to go in there at that time. I'd love to go back and see them. Some of these islands, and one of them, tiny island, that was traded for Manhattan. Which one it was?
Yeah, yeah.
I'd love to go there.
Well, if there are no other questions, I'll just leave it open just for a little bit. If you could all just thank Dr. Duffy, thank you, Michael, for your time today.
Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for indulging me and allowing me to reminisce and rabbit on.
I also have to have a chat to you. I've mentioned to Sam actually earlier in this year about helping out the Year 12s, and he seemed quite keen at the time, but he's dropped off. I haven't heard from him since.
You should lean on him. He's got time on his hands. He can do it.
That's good to hear, at least. They've got a couple of weeks before their exam, so yeah, any tips and tricks, I guess, I think they'll find very useful. But thank you very much again for your chat. I think it's good to think about, or for these students to think about their future and how Indonesia might play a bit of a role in that.
Yeah. So good luck everyone with the exams, and yeah, I hope you enjoy your futures and you'll get to Indonesia and they let us flying planes again, or however you get there. You'll get there and get to travel around and take some time. Give yourself if you get a chance, take a few months and travel around. Traveling slow in Indonesia is the best way to do it because it's slowly there. All right. Selamat siang and sampai jumpa.
Sampai jumpa.
Sampai jumpa.
Bye, Jumpa.